The lawyer's office smelled like old paper and expensive leather. It was the kind of smell that was supposed to be comforting, a scent of stability and tradition. Today it just smelled like the end of the world. I sat perched on the edge of a stiff leather chair, my hands clasped so tightly in my lap, my knuckles were white. Across the polished mahogany table, my Aunt Cynthia dabbed at her perfectly dry eyes with a silk handkerchief. My cousins shifted beside her, their faces a practiced mask of somber respect. Mr. Gable, my grandmother's lawyer for 40 years, cleared his throat. He adjusted his glasses and looked down at the document in his hands. His voice was a flat, dispassionate drone. To my beloved daughter Cynthia, he read, I bequeath my primary residence located at 22 Willow Creek Lane, including all furnishings and property contained therein. I felt a faint ringing in my ears. That was the house I grew up in just as much as my grandmother did, the place I ran to after every scraped knee, every heartbreak. Mr. Gable continued, furthermore, I bequeath to my daughter Cynthia my entire 7-figure investment portfolio, the contents of all savings and checking accounts, and my collection of fine jewelry. A small, satisfied sigh escaped Cynthia's lips. She quickly disguised it as a sob. The room was silent for a moment. Mr. Gable shuffled a page. He looked over his glasses, his eyes finally landing on me. And to my granddaughter Leah, he read, his voice unchanging. I held my breath. I leave the small wooden box of personal mementos kept in my study in the hopes that she will cherish the memories we made together. The words hung in the air, thick and heavy. My stomach dropped. I felt the blood drain from my face. All eyes were on me. I could feel their pity, their morbid curiosity. The silence was suffocating. A box? She left me a box. My hands, resting in my lap, started to shake. I curled my fingers into fists to still them. Then I felt a hand on my arm. It was Cynthia. Her nails were perfectly manicured, a shade of blood red. Oh, Leah, dear, she whispered, her voice dripping with a sympathy so fake it was almost sharp. Don't be sad. She leaned in closer. At least you have the memories. The cruelty of it was breathtaking. It was a perfectly delivered performance. The grieving daughter, the benevolent victor. I didn't say a word. I couldn't. The protest was a hard knot in my throat. I stood up. My legs felt unsteady. Mr. Gable gestured to a corner of the room where a plain, unremarkable wooden box sat on a small table. It looked like something you'd find at a yard sale for $5. I walked over, picked it up. It was lighter than I expected. I turned and walked out of the office, the box clutched to my chest. I didn't look back. I could feel their eyes on me, their whispers already starting before the heavy door clicked shut behind me. I drove home in a daze, the wooden box sitting silently in the passenger seat. It felt like it was mocking me. I placed it on my small kitchen table and didn't touch it for 2 days. I just let it sit there, a monument to my humiliation. Then on the 3rd morning, my phone buzzed. It was Aunt Cynthia. I stared at her name on the screen, a cold pit forming in my stomach. I let it ring twice before answering. Leah, she said, her voice bright and businesslike. There was no trace of the grieving daughter from the lawyer's office. I need you to go over to the house. It needs to be cleared out by the end of the week. I was silent. I didn't know what to say. Did you hear me? She asked, a sharp edge to her tone. The realtor wants to start showing it on Monday. I need it empty. All of Mother's personal things, just box them up. You know what's what? I know what's what. The words were a casual dismissal of my grief, of my connection to the house. I was no longer family. I was the help, the unpaid archivist of a life that was being auctioned off. I have work, Cynthia, I said, my voice barely a whisper. Take some time off, she snapped. This is family business. I expect it done by Friday. The line went dead. I stood there in my kitchen, the phone still pressed to my ear. There was no please, no thank you, just an order. The next day, I unlocked the front door to my grandmother's house. The air was still and thick with the scent of her, a mix of lavender and old books. But it wasn't comforting anymore. It felt like trespassing. I started in the living room, wrapping old photographs in newspaper, my hands moving on autopilot. Cynthia arrived an hour later, not to help but to supervise. She walked through the rooms, pointing at things. This is going to my daughter. Make sure you wrap it carefully. This chair is an antique. Don't scratch it. She set her phone down on the dusty mantelpiece while she took a call in the other room. It buzzed, the screen lighting up. It was a text from a name I didn't recognize. Brenda Realtor. The message was short. Contracts are ready. Congratulations. Of course they were. The vultures were already circling. She wasn't just selling a house, she was erasing a home. Later that afternoon, I was in the library. This was our sanctuary. Hundreds of books lined the walls, each one a story she had shared with me. I was carefully placing them in boxes when Cynthia walked in, a look of distaste on her face. She picked up a worn copy of To Kill a Mockingbird, my grandmother's favorite. She flipped through it, then tossed it into an empty cardboard box with a thud. Honestly, she said, dusting off her hands, I don't know why she kept all this old junk, just a bunch of worthless paper taking up space. She walked out, leaving me alone with the silence and the weight of her words. Worthless paper, just like the box she had left for me. For 2 more days, I worked in silence, a ghost in a house that was no longer a home. I packed my grandmother's life into brown cardboard boxes, each one feeling heavier than the last. The grief was a physical weight pressing down on my chest, making it hard to breathe. I was drowning in it. By Wednesday evening, I was emotionally exhausted. I sat on the floor of the dusty study, surrounded by boxes labeled kitchen, linens, clothing. I had saved the memento box for last. I hadn't had the strength to open it. It felt too final, but now I needed it. I needed something, anything, to feel close to her again. My hands trembled slightly as I lifted the plain wooden lid. The top layer was a collection of old photographs, their edges curled with age. I sifted through them, my fingers tracing the faded images of a life well lived. There was my grandmother as a young woman, her smile bright and fearless. There she was with my grandfather on their wedding day. And then there was one of me. It was from my college graduation 6 years ago. I was in my cap and gown, grinning like an idiot, and she was standing beside me, her arm wrapped around my shoulder, her eyes shining with a pride so fierce it practically radiated off the glossy paper. I had forgotten this picture existed. I turned it over. Her familiar, elegant handwriting filled the back. To my brilliant archivist, it read, "You have a gift, Leah. You see the value in things that others overlook. Never let anyone make you doubt that." A tear slipped down my cheek and splashed onto the photograph. I wiped it away quickly. It felt like she was speaking to me right here in this quiet, lonely room. It was a shield against Cynthia's cruel words, a reminder of who I was. Her words were a balm on a wound that was still raw and bleeding. I was so lost in the moment that I didn't hear Cynthia come home. I only realized she was there when I heard her voice from the living room, loud and cheerful. She was on the phone. "I'm telling you, Carol, it was easier than I thought," she said, followed by a peal of laughter that sounded obscene in the quiet house. The old woman was losing it at the end. It was easy to convince her to simplify things. She was practically begging me to take over her finances. My blood ran cold. I sat frozen on the floor, the photograph clutched in my hand. And Leah Cynthia continued, her voice dropping into a conspiratorial whisper. "Oh, please. The girl is a mess. It's almost pathetic, really. She's in here right now, probably crying over that box of old junk Grandma left her while I'm about to cash in a 7-figure check." She laughed again, a sharp, ugly sound. Honestly, what would she even do with the money? She's the family failure for a reason. Better it's in the hands of someone who knows how to use it. I'm doing her a favor, really. The photograph in my hand trembled not from sadness, but from a sudden cold fury. The tears on my cheeks dried. The grief in my chest vanished, replaced by something hard and sharp and glacial. I placed the picture carefully back in the box and stood up, my movements slow and deliberate. I walked to the doorway of the study and looked into the living room. Cynthia had her back to me, still chatting away, oblivious. I watched her for a long moment. I saw her not as my aunt, not as family, but as a stranger. A thief who had stolen my home, my inheritance, and my grandmother's legacy, all while mocking my pain. I felt my jaw clench. My knuckles turned white as my hand rested on the doorframe. And just like that, the part of me that had spent 28 years craving their approval, the part that was afraid to make waves, the part that always backed down, died. Something inside me snapped. The rage didn't burn hot, it burned cold. It was a clarity I had never felt before. All the years of biting my tongue, of swallowing my disappointment, of making myself smaller to keep the peace, it all evaporated in that single ugly moment of truth. I didn't confront Cynthia. I didn't scream or cry. I did something else. I went back to work. But this time I wasn't packing away a life. I was excavating it. I walked back into the study and looked at the boxes not as collections of memories, but as an archive, an unsolved case. My professional instincts, the very skills Cynthia and my family had always dismissed as a quirky, unprofitable hobby, took over. I cleared my grandmother's large oak desk, wiping away a thick layer of dust. I found a pair of white cotton gloves in my purse. I always kept a pair for handling delicate documents and put them on. I began to unpack the memento box again, but this time with the dispassionate focus of a researcher. I laid every item out on the desk, creating a meticulous grid. Letters on the left, photographs in the center, objects on the right. I categorized the letters by date. I examined the photographs with a magnifying glass from my grandmother's desk drawer, looking for details in the background. I documented everything. This was my world, and I was good at it. My eyes scanned the objects. A silver locket, a collection of sea glass from a vacation we took when I was 10, a dried corsage from her wedding. And then I saw it. Her pen. It was a vintage fountain pen, its black enamel worn smooth from years of use. It wasn't just any pen. It was her signature pen. The one she used to sign her will when my grandfather passed, the one she used to write the letters that got my mother into a good college. It was the pen for things that mattered. On instinct, I uncapped it. I gently pressed the nib to a blank piece of paper. A perfect, thin line of dark blue ink appeared. It wasn't dry. It had been used recently. My heart began to beat a little faster. It was a breadcrumb, a tiny, insignificant detail that anyone else would have overlooked. But my grandmother knew I wouldn't. I turned my attention to the boxes of books I had rescued from Cynthia's junk pile. If she had left me one clue, maybe she had left others. I worked through the night, fueled by coffee and a cold, burning sense of purpose. I scanned every title, checked every dust jacket. It was almost dawn when I found it at the bottom of the last box. It was an old, heavy textbook from her time in law school. It looked like 1,000 others, but there was one difference. A thin silk ribbon was tucked between the pages, marking a spot. My fingers, still gloved, felt clumsy as I opened the book to the marked section. I read the chapter title, and the air left my lungs in a sudden rush. Chapter 9, Holographic Wills and Their Precedence in State Law. I stared at the words. A holographic will, a will written entirely by hand, the pen on the desk still wet with ink, the bookmarked chapter. It wasn't a coincidence, it was a message. My grandmother, the lawyer, had left me a trail, and I, the archivist, was about to follow it to the very end. The book felt heavy in my hands, heavier than its pages should allow. I ran my gloved fingers over the worn leather cover. My grandmother had always been meticulous. A simple ribbon as a bookmark felt too obvious for her. It was a signpost, not the destination. My archivist training taught me that the most important information is often hidden in the construction of the object itself. I examined the binding, the spine, the way the pages were set. Then I saw it. A faint line along the inside of the back cover, almost perfectly flush with the decorative paper. The cover was thicker than the front one by a few millimeters. It was a false bottom, a secret compartment. My breath caught in my throat. I carried the book to the desk, my heart pounding a steady, heavy rhythm against my ribs. I retrieved a thin, flexible palette knife from the small toolkit I always carried for my work, a tool meant for separating delicate, ancient pages. I slid the knife into the barely there seam. It was a slow, painstaking process. I had to be careful not to tear the old paper. Millimeter by millimeter, I worked my way around the edge. There was a soft crackle of old glue giving way, and then the false panel lifted. It wasn't empty. Nestled in the hollowed-out space was a packet of papers wrapped in a faded black silk ribbon. It wasn't a jumble of loose sheets. It was a formal, deliberate package. My hands were perfectly steady as I lifted it out. This was what she wanted me to find. I carefully untied the ribbon. The papers were not old and brittle, but crisp, high-quality legal stationery. At the top of the first page, embossed in elegant script, were the words, "From the desk of Evelyn Reed, attorney at law." Her name, her old firm. And below it, written in her own unmistakable hand, was the familiar flowing script I had known my entire life. The ink was the same dark blue as the ink from the fountain pen. I unfolded the pages. There were 3 of them, front and back. The title at the top was clear and unambiguous: Last Will and Testament. I scanned the document, my eyes flying across the page. It was all there, clause after clause laid out with the cold, irrefutable precision of a master legal mind. It revoked all previous wills. It named me, Leah Reed, as the sole executor. And then the final devastating clause: I bequeath my entire estate, including all property, real and personal, all financial accounts and investments, and all personal effects, to my beloved and trusted granddaughter, Leah. At the bottom of the final page was her full, elegant signature, and beside it, the date, written just 3 weeks before she passed away. Tucked into the fold of the will was a single, smaller sheet of matching stationery. It was a letter, addressed to me. My dearest Leah, it began. If you are reading this, then you have proven me right. You have looked past the noise and seen the truth. I am sorry to have put you through this ordeal, but I had to know. I had to know who truly valued my legacy and who only valued my money. The will they have is a decoy I created months ago, a test of character for those I leave behind, a test I am afraid they have failed spectacularly. This house, this life I built, it is not for the greedy or the cruel. It is for someone with a patient heart and a sharp mind. It is for you. This is your inheritance and your burden. I trust you will know what to do with it, my brilliant archivist. I read the letter 3 times, the words blurring through a fresh wave of tears. But these were not tears of grief, they were tears of validation, of love, of a profound, unbreakable connection that even death could not sever. She hadn't abandoned me. She had trusted me. I folded the letter and the will, my movements precise. I slipped them back into their silk ribbon. I placed the packet in an acid-free archival sleeve from my bag. The plan began to form in my mind, not in a rush, but with the slow, deliberate certainty of a chess master seeing the entire board, Cynthia's greed, her arrogance, her utter dismissal of me. These were no longer just insults. They were weapons. My grandmother had left me a shield and a sword, and I was going to use them. The first step in building a perfect trap is to understand your target's appetite. My Aunt Cynthia's was simple greed. She didn't just want the inheritance she had stolen. She wanted every last penny, and she believed it was her right. That arrogance would be her undoing. I spent the next 48 hours not just planning, but preparing my bait. I went through another set of boxes from the attic, the ones filled with decades of old financial records. Tucked away in a dusty folio, I found exactly what I was looking for: 3 old passbook savings accounts from a bank that had been bought out twice over. They were practically ancient, the balances totaling no more than a few $100s, but they looked official. They looked like forgotten money. I placed them inside a worn manila envelope. On a separate yellowed piece of notepaper, I scribbled a note in a rushed, frantic-looking script, intentionally misspelling a word. Need to check on these unlisted assets, I wrote. I left the envelope on the corner of the dining room table, partially hidden beneath a stack of old magazines, a place where a nosy person thinking they were being sneaky would be sure to look. Then I made the call. I took a deep breath, consciously pitching my voice higher, softer. I summoned the old Leah, the one who was always apologizing for taking up space. She answered on the second ring. What is it, Leah? I'm busy. Hi, Aunt Cynthia, I said, my voice trembling slightly. It was a good performance. I'm so sorry to bother you. I've finished most of the packing, but I had a question about some of the legal papers. I could practically hear her eyes rolling. What legal papers? Just some things about the estate, I said vaguely. I get so confused by all of it. I was thinking maybe we could all meet with Mr. Gable one last time, just to sign a final piece of paper saying everything is settled, so you don't have to worry about any loose ends from me later. I want this to be as smooth as possible for you. There was a pause. I had dangled the bait perfectly. I wasn't a threat. I was a nuisance, trying to be helpful, offering to sign away my own rights to make her life easier. Fine, she huffed the dismissal, clear in her tone. If it will stop you from calling me with stupid questions, fine. I'll arrange it with Gable for Friday. And don't be late. She hung up. I smiled. The hook was set. But I wasn't leaving this to chance. The next day, I took an afternoon off work and went to a small law office on the other side of town. I paid for a 1-hour consultation with a sharp-eyed estate lawyer named Mr. Davies. I didn't give him my real name. I didn't show him my grandmother's will. I simply laid out a hypothetical scenario. Theoretically, I began if a person were to pass away and their officially filed will was incomplete, and if another, more recent, entirely handwritten will were to surface, what would the legal standing be? He leaned back, steepling his fingers. In this state, a holographic will, if properly dated and signed, is ironclad. It would supersede any previously filed typewritten will, period. My heart hammered against my ribs. Ironclad, I repeated. Absolutely, he said. He then leaned forward, a glint in his eye. Now, if you really wanted to make it a checkmate, you'd get the beneficiary of the first will to sign a binding final settlement and no contest agreement before you produce the holographic will. By signing it, they'd be legally waiving their right to contest any future claims or discoveries. It would be a thing of beauty. I paid him in cash for his time. I walked out of his office into the bright afternoon sun, the city noise fading into a dull roar. Checkmate. The word echoed in my mind. The board was set. The pieces were in motion. All Cynthia had to do now was walk into the trap. Friday arrived. We met in the same conference room where my world had fallen apart less than 2 weeks ago. The air was thick with the same smell of old leather and false sympathy, but this time something was different. I was different. I sat in the same chair, but I didn't feel small. I felt a cold, calm clarity. Cynthia sat opposite me, radiating impatience. She tapped her crimson nails on the polished table and shot a pointed look at her gold watch. Mr. Gable sat at the head of the table, his face neutral, a witness to a proceeding he clearly found unusual. Let's get this over with, Cynthia said, not looking at me but at the lawyer. Of course, I said, my voice soft. I reached into my briefcase and pulled out a single document neatly bound in a blue cover. I just wanted to thank you again, Aunt Cynthia, for agreeing to this. It gives me such peace of mind. I pushed the document across the table. The title was printed in bold letters, Final Estate Settlement and No Contest Agreement. Cynthia picked it up, glanced at the title, and scoffed. Honestly, Leah, all this drama for nothing. I just want to be sure everything is tidy, I said, echoing the words of a meek little mouse. The document just confirms that we all accept the will as it was read as final and absolute, and that we waive any right to contest it or any other claims in the future. It's just a formality. Mr. Gable shifted in his seat, a flicker of professional curiosity in his eyes. He started to speak. Perhaps you should read. I don't need to read it, Cynthia interrupted, waving a dismissive hand. She was so sure of her victory, so sure of my weakness, that she couldn't be bothered with the details. Her eyes were already on the prize, the new life she had stolen. Where's a pen? I pushed my own pen, a simple black ballpoint, across the table toward her. She uncapped it. This was the moment, the culmination of every sleepless night, every calculated step. The air in the room grew thin. The ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall sounded like a hammer striking an anvil. With a flourish of her wrist, she signed her name on the final page. The scratch of the nib on the thick paper was the loudest sound I had ever heard. She slid the document back to me, a triumphant smirk playing on her lips. There. Are we done? I took the signed agreement, my movements unhurried. I straightened the pages and placed them carefully back in their blue cover. I slid the cover into my briefcase. I clicked the latches shut. Then I looked up at her. For the first time, I met her gaze directly, and I did not look away. Almost, I said, my voice no longer soft, but as clear and cold as ice. I reached back into my briefcase and pulled out a second item. It was the archival sleeve containing my grandmother's handwritten will. I placed it gently on the center of the table. Now that we have all legally agreed that there will be no future contests, I said, my voice ringing with a newfound authority, I would like to present our grandmother's actual final will for probate. Cynthia stared at the packet. Her smirk faltered. What is this? What is this nonsense? It's no nonsense, I said. It's my grandmother's last testament. Written, signed, and dated by her own hand 3 weeks before she passed. Cynthia's face, which had been flushed with victory, began to pale. "That's absurd. It's a fake," Mr. Gable tell her. "It's a fake." Mr. Gable, his professional composure finally broken, picked up the sleeve. He slid the documents out with a reverence I knew he didn't have for the typewritten forgery. He read the first page. His eyes widened. He turned to the last page, examining the signature, then the date. He looked up first at me with a dawning sense of shock and awe. Then he looked at Cynthia, and his expression was one of cold, legal finality. "Cynthia," he said, his voice grave, "the signature is authentic. The date supersedes the document we filed. And you," he added, his gaze flicking to the signed agreement in my briefcase, "have just waived your right to challenge it." The room was silent, save for the sound of my aunt's ragged, panicked breathing. The 6 months that followed were not a whirlwind, but a quiet, steady rebuilding. The storm had passed, and in its wake, there was a profound and beautiful calm. The house on Willow Creek Lane, which had felt like a mausoleum haunted by grief and betrayal, slowly began to breathe again. The first thing I did was throw open every window, letting the fresh air chase out the stale scent of dust and sorrow. The oppressive silence that had once filled the hallways was replaced by the soft hum of a classical radio station and the rhythmic ticking of the old grandfather clock in the hall, which I had carefully repaired and wound myself. I didn't hire a cleaning crew. The work was mine to do. I treated it not as a chore, but as a ritual. I polished the dark wood of my grandmother's desk until the grain shone like liquid amber, feeling the strength of her presence in its solid form. I washed the windows until the afternoon sun streamed in, no longer filtered through a film of neglect, but bright and unapologetic, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air like tiny golden sprites. The house began to feel like mine, not through a signature on a deed, but through the mindful labor of my own 2 hands. I was no longer an intruder in my own memories. I was their curator. I didn't hear from Cynthia. Not a single call, not one vitriolic text message. I heard whispers through the family grapevine, of course, stories of outrage, of disbelief, of a woman consumed by a narrative in which she was the victim, but it all felt distant, like a story about someone I used to know. The silence from her was the most telling thing of all. It was the silence of utter defeat. The final chapter of her story arrived not with a bang, but in a crisp, cream-colored envelope on a Tuesday morning. It bore the letterhead of Mr. Gable's law firm. I was in the kitchen, a half-eaten croissant and a cup of coffee on the table, the morning light soft on the newly painted walls. For a moment, my heart gave a small, traitorous flutter, a phantom limb of old anxieties. But it passed as quickly as it came. I was no longer the girl who feared bad news. My hands were steady as I slid a butter knife under the seal. The letter was formal, its language precise and devoid of emotion, a simple summary of the estate's final proceedings. It confirmed that my grandmother's holographic will had been fully executed and the estate officially closed. Then it detailed in stark black and white the aftermath of the disastrous meeting. Cynthia, in her blind rage, had done exactly what I had gambled on. She had refused to accept reality. She hired an expensive and notoriously aggressive legal team to have the holographic will thrown out, filing a lawsuit that cited everything from undue influence to forgery. She painted a picture of a senile old woman being manipulated by a conniving granddaughter. But the document I had tricked her into signing, the final estate settlement and no contest agreement, was an unbreakable legal cage. Her expensive lawyers fought for 2 months before the judge dismissed the case with prejudice, calling it an audacious and frivolous waste of the court's time. The agreement she had signed so arrogantly without even reading was absolute. The final paragraph was the most devastating. Because her lawsuit was deemed frivolous and in direct violation of the legally binding agreement she had willingly signed, the court had ordered her to pay all associated legal costs, not just for her own high-priced team, but for the estate's defense as well. My costs, the fees, the letter noted, were astronomical. To cover them, she had been forced to put her own home, the one she had been so proud of, on the market. She hadn't just lost the inheritance, she had lost everything she already had consumed by the fire of her own insatiable greed. I folded the letter and placed it on the table. I did not feel a rush of triumph. I did not feel a surge of vengeful joy at her ruin. I felt a quiet release. It was the feeling of a great weight being lifted, a weight I hadn't even realized I was still carrying. The anger and hurt that had fueled me for weeks had cooled, leaving behind not a scar, but a smooth, calm space. She had become irrelevant. Her story was over. Mine was just beginning. Last week, I visited the university not as an employee, but as a benefactor. I sat in the dean's office, the polished wood and academic air, feeling more welcoming than ever. Across from me sat Dr. Anya Sharma, the head of the history department, a woman with kind eyes and a brilliant mind. "The Evelyn Reed Memorial Scholarship for Archival Sciences," she said, reading the charter I had prepared. "Leah, this is one of the most generous and thoughtful endowments we have ever received." My grandmother was a lawyer. I explained, my voice clear and confident. She believed that the truth was the most valuable thing a person could possess. But she also knew that the truth isn't always loud. Sometimes it's hidden in a forgotten letter and a faded signature in the margins of a dusty book. I looked out the window at the students crossing the campus lawn. I want to help the people who have the patience and the passion to find it. The ones who, like my grandmother said, see the value in things that others overlook. Dr. Sharma smiled, a genuine, warm expression. "I think she would be incredibly proud of you, Leah." This evening, I sit in my grandmother's library. It is no longer a tomb of memories, but a living, breathing space. Her books are meticulously organized, their spines aligned. The air smells of beeswax and old paper. A vase of white roses. Her favorite sits on the corner of the great oak desk. My work is here now. My life is here. I am holding the photograph from my graduation, the one that started it all. I look at my grandmother's proud smile, the fierce love in her eyes, and I finally completely understand. The money, the house, they were never the real inheritance. They were simply the tools she left me. The true inheritance was the lesson that my quiet nature was not weakness, but strength. That my methodical mind was not a quirky hobby, but a powerful weapon. That my worth was never determined by the approval of others, but by my own integrity. She didn't just leave me a house full of things. She left me a choice, a chance to fight for myself, a chance to become the person she always knew I was. I didn't just inherit an estate, I inherited her legacy, and I would spend the rest of my life honoring it.